Hi, good morning. I'm in Principe Pio, and you can see that red building. That's the railway station of Principe Pio. And in front of us we have the Puerta de San Vicente. I'll talk a little bit about grammar, some observations. This looks like a monument of the area of Principe Pio from 1909 to 2009. So what is the problem with grammar? Why is grammar such a big issue for language learners and English language learners? If you look behind the trees there's the palace. And if you can see that cupola, the dome there, that's the Cathedral of the Almudena. I think today is not a good day to record here in Principe Pio. They're cutting the grass, but the autumn leaves are relatively interesting. So what is the problem with grammar? Basically, when students find it difficult to use the language, they conclude that they need more grammar. And this is quite understandable. So as students of English and our language, we are made to buy books which inevitably include grammar and so-called grammar structures. This, we are told, is very important to learn a language. Let's go down again to the Jardines de Virgen del Puerto. Maybe it's quieter now. So the problem is that grammar, we are told, is very important, and this is not to say that it's not. Grammar indeed is important. The question is, what is grammar? The other aspect of grammar is that the syntax or grammar and structure of a language can be codified in books and written down. And thus, it's much easier to identify what is knowledge about the structure of a language as opposed to some ideas which may or may not be the structure of a language. And because the rules can be codified and written down, we can even test students on how much they know, how much they remember. And we can test them on their skills and mastery of the language. So there are many reasons why students don't feel confident about their skills. Let's have a look at the river, if we can see it from here. So there are many reasons why students don't feel confident with practicing their language skills, practicing their new language skills, and confident about their progress in learning the language. However, whilst this is a natural concern and an indication, if anything, that the student is keen, is concerned about their progress, it's unlikely that the problem is purely a matter of learning more grammar. I doubt it if grammar is the real problem here. Maybe it is, but not really. There are other factors to consider when assessing why a student is not learning. So in our analysis of why students are not learning, one of the obvious reasons could be lack of practice. You can't just remember a language by not using it, by not practicing it. It's just going to be difficult. Secondly, so this is the Manzanares River. Not much of a river, but this is it. Another reason why students find learning and using the language difficult is because they don't read. Without reading, you're not going to get much progress in learning a language. Also, preparation. Don't expect to turn up at a meeting or turn up at the airport and start speaking English without having prepared anything. Negative feelings or a negative frame of mind is another cause why it's proving to be difficult to learn the language. And then a few students might resent or don't like having to learn the language. So they blame the complexity of grammar as a setting for their failure to learn the language, and therefore have an excuse to stop trying to learn the language. This is very common when bosses impose on their employees having to learn a language or having to learn English specifically without any extra reward or remuneration for their efforts. What we know for sure is that learning a language and learning English, it's not very easy. And grammar will always prove to be a difficult subject. Although the traditional view of grammar includes rules and tenses and structures and word order and all this stuff, and even more, that grammar can be codified, it is not, however, the best place to start learning a second language. Indeed, learning a second language by saying you're learning grammar is a really bad move. It's really not a good start for students. So I've never been here. Let's try and cross this small bridge. It's basically a water control of the river. So it's a false start trying to start from learning the rules. So there is a principle which is evidently true and which I have just made up, is that it's much easier to add 1% to your existing knowledge about something than to learn 100% knowledge of something you know nothing about. So I'll repeat that. It's much easier to learn 1% more, of what you know already than to know 100% or to learn 100% of something you know nothing about. So basically what I'm trying to say is, so a good start to build your grammar skills is to start with something you already know. So starting from what you already know means that the most important thing about grammar is that vocabulary and not the tense structures is the most important place to start. So these are some of the birds that inhabit the Rio Manzanares. So the first place to start is to expand your vocabulary about things and subjects you already know about. Adding new words to things you already know, or things which you need to know, for example for your work, needs, traveling, whatever. So in the background there you can see the palace, and if I can move this, and there you have the dome of the cathedral. An important thing about what I mean by vocabulary, I don't just mean words, but also such things as noun groups, phrasal verbs, expressions, sayings, technical words like passport and so on. So it's not just one word. You're not learning just one word. You're learning in English a host of different structures of words which have a meaning. They represent a concept. So this is the Puente de Segovia. It's coming up, and you can see it there in the background. This is not exactly the sexiest part of Madrid, but it is certainly neglected, and previous local administrations have spent some serious money in doing it up. Another thing about vocabulary, learning vocabulary, is that vocabulary is very context driven. It's not a good idea to learn word lists. Maybe you can have some, but not necessarily a good exercise to learn to increase your vocabulary. Another view of the Manzanares, but at least there are some ducks there in the background. So we learn vocabulary through a context, which means we need to read. Reading is a must in vocabulary building, and maybe listening, but that might be more difficult than reading. The way to expand your vocabulary is to expand what you already know. For example, words, concepts related to your work, hobbies, interest, travel, needs. Remember, vocabulary has a meaning in a context. A dictionary might give you so much in terms of meaning, but it's the context that determines the actual meaning in what is being said now. Building vocabulary in a context is easier. Take the word passport. With passport we can add another word, passport control. We can add immigration control. We can expand a little bit more, security check, customs check, taxes, VAT, value added tax, police officer, customs officer, police, security guards, queue. All these are related to the same word, passport. And there is the Puente de Segovia, full of cars and buses and traffic jams and noise. So what I'll do is I'll go up those steps on the left and try and go down again on the other side of the bridge. Okay, going up the steps you can see a good view and a good dollop of mist of the Plaza España buildings there at the background, the tall building. Moving on to the palace in the background there, and the Almudena Cathedral. I'm crossing the Puente because this fountain is making a lot of noise. I'm back on the Príncipe Pío side of the river, between Puente de Segovia and Príncipe Pío. Hopefully it's much quieter here. Fingers crossed. I doubt it. Anyway, so as I was saying, it's much easier to arrive from passport to value-added tax than, say, to learn and arrive, for example, the vocabulary golden handshake, ship manifesto, tax return, stamp duty, mortgage, leasehold, etc., etc., etc. So the question for us is, why vocabulary? One of the reasons, and the most important reason, is vocabulary is the building block of a language. Remember, vocabulary is not just a word, and we don't care about the words or phrases or phrasal verbs or whatever. What we care is the concept these groups of words convey to us. We're interested in concepts, not printed ink on a paper. Yeah. Let's have a look at these ducks. I wonder if ducks have grammar. I'm sure they have some sort of grammar to give little ducklings a headache. Vocabulary carries the information and meaning which we obtain only by context, and therefore context determines grammar. So vocabulary carries the meaning and the information we need to communicate with other people. But that meaning, that information is only released in a context. The context tells us what to understand. Vocabulary is also much easier to learn than the theory of grammar principles, principles of linguistics, philosophy, principles of philosophy of language, and so on. Even more, if you know your vocabulary, you will start becoming familiar with the grammar that goes with the vocabulary. So in a way, we're learning grammar without actually physically doing or studying grammar. As I have already said, reading and listening are good ways to learn vocabulary, learn the use of those words and concepts, and to see the grammar associated in the context of what you're hearing or reading, how to use those words. So you're learning also grammar by learning vocabulary. So what are the negative aspects about grammar and vocabulary? An important negative aspect is that vocabulary and grammar change over time, over countries, and over cultures. Very few are sacred in this language, or in any language, but in English most particular. For example, take the new trend of using the split infinitive. For example, to not work, to not think, to not write, to not eat. It's one thing to boldly go where no man or woman has ever gone, and another to not think. It's very easy to add new words, new vocabulary, new ideas, new expressions, but whatever else is possible, you need to be intelligent to introduce these new concepts. And I would say even, how shall I say, aesthetically pleasing. Much that I hate the word Brexit, it's quite a emotional, aesthetic word. To not work, to not study, it's ridiculous. Another negative aspect of grammar and vocabulary is that vocabulary, a lot of vocabulary, and up to an extent some grammar structures, some grammar styles, is very local and very culture-based, even within the same country. So you are not going to learn a set of words, a set of concepts, a list of vocabulary, and it's going to serve you throughout the world. It's not going to happen. In the same way that food and water does not taste the same everywhere. A third negative aspect is that expanding and knowing vocabulary can be just as complex as learning grammar rules and grammar principles. But vocabulary is context-driven and therefore much easier to learn, and you probably have enough context already to add a few more words and a few more principles to what you already know. We have context determines vocabulary. Vocabulary determines your ideas, and your ideas determine your grammar and the grammar you use. A very important factor is that the grammar of our language is useless when learning other languages, especially English, because we're talking about English. So the grammar of your language is not useful for you. Forget it. And no, the present perfect in English is not the same as in Spanish. Forget it. Another negative aspect is that in English especially, grammar principles and grammar rules, if you like, have many exceptions which complicate life for students and teachers because they're trying to explain the impossible. So to conclude, words and context determine grammar. We are the masters of our ideas, and grammar is the slave. We determine the grammar, not the other way around. Those are the bells from the cathedral. It's midday already. So remember, vocabulary is the most important element of grammar, and that should be our starting point. So remember, no vocabulary, no grammar, no language. This is Lawrence from Principe Pio with the bells ringing in the background from the cathedral. Goodbye and thank you.